You have probably tried at least once to explain something to a friend, like how a device works, a rule in a game, or a new idea you have learned, only to realize they still do not understand. You thought your explanation was completely clear, yet somehow it did not work. The problem is not that your friend is slow. It is that you have fallen into a cognitive trap known as the curse of knowledge. This bias affects everyone, but teachers experience it very often. When they explain something to students, they sometimes forget that their own level of understanding is much higher. They use technical words and complex expressions that make sense to them but not to beginners. And this mental trap does not happen only in classrooms, it appears in daily communication between all of us. We assume others know what we know. That is the essence of the curse of knowledge. In 1990, psychologist Elizabeth Newton showed this effect in a simple experiment. Participants were divided into two groups. One group had to tap the rhythm of a well-known song on a table, while the other tried to guess what song it was. The people who tapped were then asked to estimate how often their partners would guess correctly. On average, they predicted a 50% success rate. In reality, out of 120 songs, only 3 were correctly identified, just 2.5%. Why was there such a huge gap between expectation and reality? The tappers heard the tune clearly in their minds while they tapped. To them, the rhythm was full of meaning. But the listeners heard only an uneven series of knocks, something like Morse code without context. Those who have more information find it very hard to imagine what it is like to have less. We forget to see through someone else's eyes. Each of us looks at the world through our own experience. Remembering that others do not share it takes conscious effort. That is why it is so difficult to teach something we already know, and even harder to imagine that someone might have no idea what we are talking about. Once you are cursed by knowledge, it is almost impossible to return to the mind of a beginner. A professional athlete, for example, might find a novice's movements awkward or wrong. But that happens because the expert has already mastered the correct technique and no longer remembers what it feels like to act without that knowledge. The same thing happens everywhere, between managers and employees, marketers and customers, scientists and the public. In every conversation, there is an invisible gap in information, just like between the tappers and the listeners in Newton's experiment. How to overcome the curse? The good news is that it can be reduced. Here is how. Remind yourself that others do not know what you know. Always explain complex terms or ideas when speaking to people outside your field. What seems obvious to you may be new to them. Use examples and real-life stories instead of abstract facts. They make ideas easier to understand and remember. Ask if everything is clear and invite the listener to restate the idea in their own words. Try to imagine the other person's point of view and their level of knowledge. Being aware of this bias will not make communication perfect, but it will make it clearer, more patient, and much more effective.